In September 1944, the war in Western Europe looked like it was slipping out of Germany's hands. The Allies had broken out of Normandy, Paris had been liberated. American, British, and Canadian forces were pushing east faster than anyone had dared hope. Newspapers were already feeding the public the same fantasy that always appears when an army moves too quickly. The war might end before Christmas. But behind the headlines, behind the photographs, and the victory speeches, there was a problem so serious that it threatened to stop the entire advance. The Allies had taken Antwerp, one of the largest ports in Europe, and they had taken it almost intact. That should have changed everything. It should have become the artery that fed the final drive into Germany. Instead, it became a trap. Antwerp was useless unless the Scheldt estuary was cleared, because every ship had to pass through that narrow waterway before it could reach the port, and the Germans still controlled both sides of it. That single detail decided the next stage of the war. Not a battlefield victory, not a dramatic charge, a logistics problem. Fuel, ammunition, food, vehicles, replacement men, everything the Allied armies needed to keep moving depended on Antwerp working at full capacity. And it could not work. The armies were still advancing, but they were advancing on borrowed strength. The farther they moved, the more fragile the whole machine became. Trucks had to drive longer and longer routes. Fuel had to be stretched. Shells had to be counted. Every decision became harder because the supply line was already choking. That is the part of war that gets ignored in popular memory. People remember the tanks, the uniforms, the flags, the liberation. What actually wins or loses campaigns is usually much less glamorous. It is the ability to keep moving when the enemy is trying to make movement impossible. The people at the top knew this. Eisenhower knew it. Canadian commanders knew it. British intelligence knew it. The warning was there before Antwerp was even fully secured. The Scheldt had to be cleared immediately, or the port would remain useless. That should have been the obvious next step. Instead, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery chose a different gamble. He turned his attention to Operation Market Garden. The airborne assault meant to slice a corridor through the Netherlands and leap across the Rhine. It was bold. It was dramatic. It looked like the kind of plan that could end a war in a single sweeping motion. It also failed. And while the world watched Arnhem, the Scheldt stayed in German hands. That delay was not a minor error. It was not a matter of a few lost days. It was 6 weeks of paralysis at the exact moment when speed mattered most. 6 weeks in which the Germans had time to dig in, prepare, flood, wire, range, and transform the whole estuary into a defensive fortress. 6 weeks in which the Canadians would later be sent into a battle that should have been easier, faster, and far less costly. That is what made the Scheldt different from so many other battles. It was not simply hard. It was hard because a mistake had already made it harder before the first Canadian soldier even stepped into the mud. And the ground itself was the enemy. The Netherlands is not a country that gives up land easily. Large parts of it sit below sea level, held dry by dikes, drainage systems, and pumping stations that have existed for generations. In October 1944, the Germans destroyed that system on purpose. They blew the dikes. They flooded the polders. They turned farmland into a shallow gray inland sea. Roads disappeared underwater. Fields vanished. Farmhouses became isolated patches of higher ground, surrounded by cold water. The only places left to move were the narrow dike roads, and those roads became death traps. They were exposed, easy to range, impossible to approach without being seen, and too narrow to give any real cover. Every meter of forward movement had been pre-measured by German guns. This was not the kind of battlefield where an army could spread out and search for weakness. There was no room for that. No open flank, no hidden route, no chance to circle around and force the enemy to retreat. The Canadians had to go straight into the killing ground. They had to move forward along roads where artillery was already waiting, or through flooded ground where every step slowed them down and exposed them to fire. The water was not deep enough to hide in, but it was deep enough to make everything miserable and slow. A man could not sprint. He could not drag equipment easily. He could not help a wounded comrade without making himself visible. The terrain was built to punish courage and reward hesitation, and hesitation was exactly what the Canadians could not afford. The task fell to the 1st Canadian Army, but even that name hides how much was being asked of ordinary units on the ground. The battle was split into 2 brutal operations. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division had to clear the Breskens Pocket on the south bank of the Scheldt. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division had to force its way across the South Beveland Peninsula on the north side. On paper, those names sound like map references. In reality, they meant flooded fields, fortified farms, buried machine guns, and soldiers walking into fire that had already been waiting for them. These were not side actions. They were the core of the fight. If either one failed, Antwerp remained unusable, and the Allied advance stayed stuck. The first major assault made that reality impossible to ignore. Canadian troops crossed the Leopold Canal in darkness, using assault boats and moving under pressure from the first moment. They did not cross into confusion or empty ground. They crossed into a defended German position that had been prepared in advance and was covered by experienced infantry and artillery. The bridgehead they created was tiny, fragile, and surrounded by danger. Then, the Germans counterattacked. They hit the Canadians again and again, trying to smash the bridgehead before it could widen. Mortars came down with frightening precision. Artillery landed in the same small area until the ground itself seemed to disappear under smoke and mud. Infantry rushed forward in waves, probing for any weak point that might collapse the whole position. And yet, the Canadians held. Not because the situation was good, not because they had enough men, not because the battle was under control. They held because if they failed, the men already across the canal would be trapped and destroyed. That was the simple, brutal logic of the fight. Every unit knew that one collapse could doom the entire crossing. So they stayed in place under fire, dug in where they could, and kept fighting while exhaustion and fear piled up around them. This is where the Scheldt stopped being an abstract campaign and became something more dangerous. It became a test of whether ordinary soldiers could keep functioning in a place designed to make functioning impossible. What makes this first chapter important is that it shows the real shape of the story. The Scheldt was not a glorious breakthrough. It was the consequence of delay, bad judgment, and a battlefield engineered to kill slow movement. The Canadians were not sent into a noble challenge. They were sent into a problem that had already been made worse by someone else's choice. That is why the battle matters. It was not only a fight against German defenses, it was a fight against time already lost. And once the Canadians entered the flooded ground, there was no easy way out. Canadian troops were not walking into a normal battlefield. They were entering a place where the land had already been turned into a weapon, and every step forward meant exposing themselves to fire that had been planned long before they arrived. By the time the 2nd and 3rd Canadian Infantry Divisions were fully committed to the Scheldt, the Germans had made sure that the fight would be slow, ugly, and costly. The flooding was not an accident of war. It was deliberate. The dikes had been destroyed, the polders were underwater, and the countryside had been rearranged into a maze of narrow roads, flooded fields, shattered farms, and isolated strongpoints. For the Canadians, that meant there was no clean advance, no easy breakthrough, and no way to solve the problem with speed alone. Every village, every canal, every raised road had to be taken under pressure. And every time the Canadians gained a little ground, the Germans tried to make them pay for it immediately. The men doing this work were often exhausted before the day even began. They moved through dark, wet ground with mud pulling at their boots and water rising around them, carrying weapons, ammunition, radio sets, and the constant fear that the next step might reveal them to a machine gun. If you want to understand why the Scheldt became such a brutal chapter in Canadian military history, do not think first about maps or commanders. Think about what it meant to move a platoon through flooded land where you could not see the whole field, could not predict where the fire was coming from, and could not easily pull a wounded man back once he fell. That was the reality. It was not a battle of movement. It was a battle of endurance. The first major obstacle was the Leopold Canal, and it immediately exposed how dangerous this campaign would be. Canadian assault troops crossed in the dark, trying to establish a bridgehead on the far side before the Germans could react in full strength. But the German defense was ready. They were not broken troops running in panic. They were organized, dug in, and determined to hold. The first men across found themselves pinned in a narrow strip of ground with water behind them and enemy fire in front of them. There was no room for mistakes. If the bridgehead failed, the whole offensive could stall. So the Canadians held on while shells exploded around them, while mortars searched the ground, and while German infantry tried repeatedly to push them back into the canal. That is where the story starts to become more than a tactical problem. It becomes a test of character under pressure. A bridgehead is not just a position on a map. It is a promise that someone will survive long enough to bring others across. The first wave has to believe that the men behind them will follow, because if they do not, the first wave dies for nothing. That is what made the Leopold Canal fight so intense. The soldiers in front were not just fighting the enemy. They were fighting the possibility that they would be abandoned in place. And the only reason they kept going was because they had no other choice. They were already in it. Retreat was not an option. Survival depended on holding long enough for the rest of the force to catch up. The Germans understood this perfectly. They used artillery, mortars, and infantry attacks to attack not just the Canadians, but the very idea of a stable crossing. Their goal was to make the bridgehead feel temporary, fragile, and doomed. They wanted the Canadians to doubt whether any gain was worth the cost. This is one of the reasons the Scheldt feels different from more famous battles. It was not a single dramatic clash with a clear climax. It was a repeated grinding pressure, meant to wear the attackers down mentally as much as physically. Every shell, every counterattack, every minute spent crouched in wet earth was part of the same effort, to make the Canadians stop believing they could finish the job. But they did not stop. And this is where the battle becomes a story of stubbornness as much as bravery. Canadian engineers, infantry, and support units kept working through conditions that should have broken the operation. Bridges had to be built under fire. Supplies had to be moved through mud and water. Wounded men had to be carried out the same way the attackers had come in, through the same exposed terrain. The battlefield did not care whether a man was a rifleman, a stretcher bearer, a radio operator, or a commander. It punished everyone the same way. You could have the right plan, the right orders, and the right timing, and still lose men simply because the ground itself made everything harder. The South Beveland side of the operation was no easier. There, the Canadians faced a narrow causeway exposed to fire from both sides, one of those pieces of terrain that looks harmless until you realize it leaves you with almost no room to survive. Any movement across it had to be precise, fast, and painfully brave. There was no space to spread out, no hidden path to take, no depth to the ground. One unit moving forward could be cut down without warning, and the men behind them had to keep going anyway, because stopping meant giving the Germans exactly what they wanted. The causeway became a symbol of the whole battle, a place where geography, timing, and enemy fire all worked together to squeeze the Canadians into a shape they never wanted to be in. At this point in the campaign, one of the most important things to understand is that the Canadians were not fighting a weak enemy. The Germans defending the Scheldt were under pressure, but they were still dangerous, disciplined, and willing to make the attackers pay for every advance. That is why the Canadians could not rely on the enemy collapsing on its own. They had to push, absorb losses, and keep moving even when the ground was draining the strength out of every unit. The battle rewarded patience, but not the kind of patience that waits safely in the rear. It rewarded the kind that stays in the line while the shelling continues and the casualties rise. And here's the deeper reason this chapter matters. The Scheldt was not only a battlefield, It was a correction. It was the price of a previous mistake. The Canadians were being used to fix a problem that had been allowed to grow worse by delay. That made every assault feel heavier, because it was not just the enemy ahead of them that they were fighting. They were also fighting the consequences of time wasted elsewhere. Every inch they gained was harder than it should have been. Every casualty felt sharper, because the battle had already been made unnecessary in the sense that it should have happened sooner, before the Germans had fully turned the land into a fortress. This is where the audience has to feel the scale of what the Canadians were dealing with. They were not in a heroic sprint. They were in a slow grind through a flooded killing zone, where success came in meters and failure came in bodies. The Germans could afford to sit and force the issue. The Canadians had to keep pressing. That imbalance created the pressure that defines the whole chapter. There was no clean victory here, no moment where the battlefield suddenly opened up and became manageable. There was only the stubborn fact that if the Canadians stopped, Antwerp stayed closed, the Allied armies stayed short of supplies, and the whole Western advance remained stuck. That was the trap. And once they were inside it, the only way out was forward. The third chapter should shift from pure military pressure to the human breaking point, because that is where the story becomes unforgettable. After the Canadians spend days fighting through flooded ground, the audience needs to feel that the battle is no longer just about territory, but about endurance, exhaustion, and the strange moments of humanity that appear when both sides are being pushed beyond normal limits. At this stage, the Scheldt is no longer a clean military problem. The Germans are increasingly compressed into smaller positions, supply is failing, and the landscape itself has become a trap for everyone inside it. What makes this chapter powerful is that it should not only show violence, it should show what happens when men who have been trying to kill each other suddenly see the same cold, the same water, the same wounds, and the same fear. That contrast is what gives the story its emotional weight. For a 10 out of 10 version, this chapter should center on one or two very concrete situations. One should follow a Canadian unit moving through flooded ground and encountering wounded German soldiers left behind in the water. Another should show the Canadian side still trying to complete the battle under terrible conditions, with stretcher bearers, engineers, and infantry all working in a landscape that offers no mercy. The audience should feel the war narrowing until it becomes a series of almost intimate encounters, not just a front line. The key is to make this chapter feel like the point where the story changes from Canadians clearing ground to men deciding what kind of soldiers they are when nobody's watching. That is what will keep listeners hooked. The most interesting part is not simply that they were fighting. It is that in the middle of this dead, flooded place, they still had to choose how to treat the enemy when the enemy was helpless. That creates the strongest possible setup for the final chapter. So the third chapter should be built around collapse, exhaustion, and the first signs that the battle is turning from conquest into moral judgment. It should feel tighter, darker, and more personal than the first two chapters. That is the moment where the story stops being just a campaign and becomes something much more memorable. In the final phase of the Scheldt battle, the story becomes less about advancing and more about what remains after a battlefield has been stripped down to its most basic human truths. By this point, the Canadians have already paid the price of the campaign in fatigue, fear, and casualties. The Germans have lost the ability to hold the entire line, but they are still dangerous in pockets, still armed, still capable of inflicting losses, and still determined to make the last meters as costly as possible. That means the final chapter cannot simply be about victory. It has to show what victory actually looked like in this place: slow, muddy, exhausted, and morally complicated. What makes the end of the Scheldt so powerful is that the battle does not finish in one dramatic instant. It ends by compression. The defenders are squeezed out of strong points. The flooded ground closes around them. Supply disappears. Communication breaks down. Isolated groups of soldiers are left with water around them and no real way to change what is coming next. This is where the story becomes personal in the strongest way. Men who only hours earlier were trying to kill each other are now reduced to the same basic condition: wet, cold, trapped, and waiting for the next decision to be made by someone else. That is the point where the battle stops being about national symbols and becomes about human behavior under extreme pressure. This chapter should also carry the aftermath of the choices made in the earlier parts of the story. The delay that made the Scheldt so hard is now paid for in full. The Canadians have done the work that should have been done earlier, and they have done it under conditions that made the price much higher than it needed to be. That does not just matter as a military fact. It matters because it changes how the audience understands the entire campaign. The battle was not inevitable in this form. It became this costly because of the wrong priorities, the wrong sequence, and the wrong attention given to the wrong operation. That gives the ending a sharper edge. At the same time, this is the chapter where the audience should feel the meaning of the Canadian effort finally become visible. The clearing of the Scheldt opens Antwerp. That is the strategic payoff. The Allied supply system, which had been slowing and tightening under pressure, can finally breathe again. Fuel starts moving. Ammunition starts moving. The armies that had been held in place by logistics can begin advancing again. This is the part of the story where the audience understands that the battle, though forgotten by many, changed the course of the war in Western Europe. It was not a side note. It was the thing that made the next phase of the war possible. But for emotional impact, the ending should not rush straight to triumph. It should hold on the strange contrast between strategic success and human exhaustion. The Canadians did not emerge from the Scheldt as a clean, untouched force. They came out of it worn down, having fought in conditions that many of them would never forget and struggle to describe later. That is important because it keeps the story honest. The victory was real, but it was expensive. The audience needs to feel both sides of that truth: what was gained and what it cost. The strongest ending for this chapter is one that comes back to the people who witnessed what happened in the flooded fields. Dutch civilians remembered Canadian soldiers carrying wounded men through water. German prisoners remembered being treated by the same men who had just fought them. That memory matters because it gives the story its final emotional shape. The battle is not remembered only for the ground taken or the port opened. It is remembered for what kind of soldiers were there at the end, when no one was asking them to be anything except tired men in a flooded country, and they still chose to behave with a kind of dignity that survived the war. So the final chapter should end with the meaning of the Scheldt, rather than just the facts of its conclusion. It should show that this was a battle that helped win the war in the West, but also one that revealed something harder to measure: the difference between fighting an enemy and becoming less human in the process. The Canadians did not just clear a waterway. They paid for the use of Antwerp, reopened the Allied advance, and left behind memories that lasted far longer than the battle itself. That is what makes the ending complete. It closes the military story while leaving the audience with the deeper one: that in the worst conditions, people sometimes still choose decency, and that choice can outlast the war itself.